my Lord and my God. I firmly believe that you are here, that you see me, that you hear me. I adore you with profound reverence. I ask you for pardon of my sins and grace to make this time of prayer fruitful. My Mother Immaculate, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me. Today's Gospel reading from the Mass is one of those tough passages in which we might think that Jesus sounds harsh and unmerciful. But when we think about it, the opposite is true, that he says quite hard things because he loves us so much. He's prepared to talk straight about things, in this case about sin and even about hell. He's prepared to talk straight about these things because he is worried for us. And he is especially worried, I think, when we fall into a particularly dangerous trap, and that is the trap of trivializing evil, giving it no importance, saying to ourselves, or saying to others, which is probably worse, sins aren't really important. They do no lasting damage. They're quickly forgotten, whatever we might say, but trivializing evil. Jesus, on the contrary, he says we should do anything to avoid committing grave sin. And he gives, by way of anything, the rather dramatic image of even cutting off our hand or our foot or plucking out an eye if they were the things to cause us to sin. Now, of course, Jesus is not saying we should maim ourselves if our hand, our foot, our eye should cause us to sin, because that's not really a lasting solution. But what Jesus is saying, that we should hate sin more than we would hate to be maimed, to lose a hand or a foot or an eye. So here's the passage. And if your hand should cause you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter into life crippled than to have two hands and go to hell, into the fire that cannot be put out. And if your foot should cause you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter into life lame than to have 2 feet and be thrown into hell. And if your eye should cause you to sin, tear it out. It is better for you to enter into the kingdom of God with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into hell, where their worm does not die, nor fire go out. Here we see that Jesus mentions hell not just once, not just twice, 3 times. And on top of that, he talks about hell twice being the place where fire cannot be put out. So in that sense, it is a tough passage. And we have to take it seriously. The church has always taught that the way we get serious about avoiding sin is, again, not by maiming ourselves, but by avoiding what has always been called occasions of sin. An occasion of sin is any place or person or thing that, by its nature or because of our frailty, could lead a person into committing sin. So that person, being with that person, visiting that place, or having that thing, is very likely to cause a person to sin. Now, obviously, there's things that we all do, and that there's a very remote chance that this might indirectly lead us to sin. Think going on holidays, to a normal place, going to university, just being alive. These are things that in a sort of remote sense are occasions of sin. That's not what the church means. But rather, there's something like perhaps visiting a certain nightclub, being alone with somebody we shouldn't be alone with. That is what they call a proximate or a close occasion of sin. And that's what we're talking about. That's what Jesus is talking about. They are people, are events, are things that we have to really avoid with great commitment. And if we avoid them, There's no problem. There's a story told of a travelling salesman arriving in a certain village in a cart, and in his cart he had a whole load of little boxes. And the villagers quickly swarm around, great, all the excitement, travelling salesman, and they're wondering what is in these little boxes. And the salesman says, I have in those little boxes the definitive cure for donkey kicks. And there's great commotion because the villagers are always getting kicked by their donkeys. So he sells out in minutes, and the villagers then excitedly start opening their little boxes and see that the box contains just a length of string, about 6 foot, 2 meters of string, nothing else. And some of them start complaining, saying, this is a Swiss. All there is in the box is a length of string. And the travelling salesman, he says, no, this is not a Swiss. This is an infallible cure. If you stay that distance away from the rear end of the donkey, you will never be kicked again. Of course, it's quite true. And that is a picture of the occasion of sin. Avoiding the occasion of sin is like having 6 feet or 2 meters of string distance between us and the sin, us and the back of the donkey. Also, when Jesus talks about this, he's saying, don't be afraid to be radical. Sin is so bad. Its effects, we're literally playing with fire, playing with the fire of hell that Jesus talks about. And so don't be afraid to be radical to avoid sin. There's a story of St. Josemaria during the Civil War when he was offered refuge in an apartment, refuge that in fact might have been necessary to save his life because he had nowhere to stay, and priests were being hunted down early on in the Spanish Civil War and being killed, and he was on a kind of a list of those that were thought to be killed. So it was very important that he get refuge, and he was offered then the key of this apartment. So he gave him the key. A friend gave him the key, and he asked whether anybody else be there, and he's told nobody else, just a housekeeper, a lady in her early 20s. And he took the key out of his pocket and dropped it down a drain, saying he would never take the chance that he might compromise his priestly celibacy. He knew that was a temptation. He was a young priest. Everybody was kind of up the walls, we might say, with nervousness and so on. And in that situation, it would have been very foolish. It would have been a proximate occasion of sin to go into that apartment and spend days or weeks in that apartment with nobody else there but this young lady. So radical. In a certain sense, he was risking his life or throwing away a very, very significant safeguard to his life by throwing that key down the drain. So for us, we think of that. Jesus talks about the hand, chopping off our hand. Okay, don't chop off our hand, but maybe drop the phone. The phone that is leading me to so many distractions, leading me to sloth, leading me not to study, or other things. It's okay, I'm not going to chop off my hand, but I can cut out my phone or cut off my phone. That is something I can do. Radical, depending on the how sinful or damaging this situation is. Don't be afraid to be radical. Instead of chopping off our foot, instead of going somewhere to meet somebody I shouldn't meet with, what I could say, well, I won't chop off my feet, but I won't go there. I won't walk there. I won't travel there, because that is a proximate or a likely occasion of sin. Or plucking at our eyes. Well, we don't pluck at our eyes, but watching sinful things. Well, better than I would pluck at my eyes, in a sense, but simpler disconnect the web or put away that laptop. And that way that proximate occasion of sin is solved. So that's what Jesus is, in his kindness and in his concern and his love for us, is talking to us about today. So let's not be afraid of common sense, like those villagers getting kicked by the donkeys didn't have too much common sense, but also let's be daring. Let's be daring with those steps that we have to take to avoid the close or the proximate occasions of sin. I give you thanks, my God, for the good resolutions, affections, and inspirations you have communicated to me in this meditation. I ask you for help to put them into effect. My Mother Immaculate, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me.